Hi Tom, how are you?
I'm good, Nick. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, thank you, thanks. Thanks for sitting down with us. We're going to chat about high performance culture.
Yes.
So let's just go right back to the basics. So why is it so important these days, especially with like the organizational changes and technology changes that are happening so rapidly?
This is a topic I'm a bit obsessed with, to be honest. And, my fundamental opinion is that high performance culture is the core of business success, and I'll explain why that is a little bit. But I think it's even more important now in that sort of environment of change that you talked about, because everything is shifting so rapidly. As a business, you need to have something constant. You need to have something to align around. And, your tactics are going to change and your way of executing what you do is going to change over the coming years. But there's got to be some steady setting. There's got to be some steady basis for where you're going, how you're trying to execute what you're doing, the principles that you operate on, that kind of thing. And that all comes down to culture. But my obsession with it kind of goes back to my own experience, actually. So back in 2022, I was running a business that had an awful year, a really bad year. We'd gone from a massive 300 grand profit the previous year. I thought I'd cracked it. I thought I knew business inside out. I thought I'd absolutely nailed it. And then over the course of the next 12 months, I managed to pilot that to a 200 grand loss. So it was quite a turnaround in the wrong direction. And I just remember watching the bank account drop. I tried not to log in every day, but at least twice a week going in, and it was dropping and dropping. And we just about made it to Christmas, and I took the day off, obviously, spent the day with my family. But then Boxing Day, I got up, and I remember sitting in the dark. No one in my house was awake. I don't think anyone in the street was awake. And I sat with a coffee and just tried to figure out what I was going to do, because something had to change. We only had a few months left at that point. And I didn't know the answer. And there was so many issues that I had to find something that united them all. And I started to look at, some companies are successful over and over and over again, whereas most companies just about survive or don't, right? So there's got to be a difference between those things. So I became a bit fascinated by this question of what is that difference? And I started studying companies that were successful over time, not just large companies, but companies in different sectors, companies different sizes. And I was just trying to find a pattern. I was just trying to find a common theme that united them. And it was really difficult because, all the companies I looked at did completely different things. They were in different locations, different sizes, all that kind of stuff. They had different resources, they faced different challenges, and it took me a long time to start to see the thread that bound them. But the one thing I noticed was that they all had really defined, really strong cultures. They all had teams and environments that allowed them to navigate the setbacks that they faced, to overcome the challenges that were set in front of them. And all their cultures were different, but they were all really strong and really robust. And that was really sort of what led me down this path to trying to understand high performance culture, because that was the only thing I could see that was the consistent difference between the few who succeed and the many that fail. So that is why high performance culture is important, because it is the difference between success and failure in whatever business you're in.
Cool. No. I'm just going to pick up on that point and the personal thing that you said about you sort of realised that things weren't right and you had to correct it. And as humans, I think we're all susceptible to not accepting that things are going wrong. Like we like to, keep going and think that it'll all be all right. So what would you say to sort of like HR managers or people managers that are looking at their culture and maybe there's a little voice in the back of their mind that's going, we're not performing as well as we should as a culture. I need to take that step. How would you encourage them or inspire them to take that leap?
Yeah, I think HR and people leaders are often in difficult positions because it's not just that they need to recognise it. They often know that there's cultural issues. It's then convincing the rest of the leadership team that culture's the problem. I think, there's a couple of things I would say. There's some exceptions to this, but most problems that you face in a business are at the core of them culture problems. because your strategy derives from your culture, the decisions people make derive from your culture, the way you market the business, the way you develop products derives from the culture. So there are other types of problems for sure, but a good chunk of the problems that any business faces, there's a cultural element at the root of them, because there's usually a people element at the core of them. I guess in terms of offering them a little bit of hope, or a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel, there is recognizing cultural issues is the first part of it. But once you've recognized that there is a cultural issue, a lot of the time it's difficult to pinpoint what it is specifically, like what the actual tangible thing is that needs fixing or needs improving. But actually, that's what we've been developing over the last few years, is this culture operating system that helps companies to see exactly where they are culturally and exactly what they need to do to go where they want to go. So there are tools, there are ways to diagnose specifically what that cultural issue is. And as soon as you can do that, we find that the rest of the leadership team is typically more accepting, because it's one thing to go to your board and say, hey, we've got a culture problem. It's another thing to go, listen, there are some cultural issues that we need to fix. They are this, this, and this, and here's what I think we should do about them. A culture problem seems like such a big, painful shift that no leadership team really wants to tackle it. Whereas if you can break it down specifically, that becomes more digestible, I think.
No, sounds good. And what are those sort of measurables that you can use to track your progress in high performance culture? And, how do you define success in this area?
There are some traditional metrics that companies have used with like culture change initiatives, and some of them are useful, but I think honestly some of them are kind of just made up. So the traditional things are to look at engagement scores from surveys, to look at retention, which is actually a hard metric. That's actually a really good one to use. Engagement scores are kind of indicative, but they're not a metric in and of themselves. I think that the trend for looking at engagement scores comes from 10 years ago, when there was a massive war for talent in every sector. So keeping people happy and engaged was the key metric, because your biggest thing was getting hold of talent and keeping hold of it. But the world's moved on a little bit since then. There are more useful metrics you can see to measure cultural change. So there's things like velocity of promotion or velocity of skill development. There are things like how quickly people are being onboarded. There are things like the quality of talent that you're attracting. So there's a few things you can measure around that in terms of time to hire, but also, what's the distance from hire to impact? How well are people performing when they come into the business? All that kind of stuff. I think a lot of it depends on what systems you already have set up, because if you've got a really good performance management system in place, you can start to see, well, how on average are we performing against our objectives? What percentage of objectives are being completed? What percentage are on time? And if you can see improvement in that, those are useful to track. But ultimately, the key indicator of whether your culture is improving is, are you more productive? Are you creating more revenue? Are you winning more customers? Are you more profitable? Those are the actual business metrics behind it. And I think, we look at some of these proxy metrics as a way to convince ourselves that we're making progress, whereas actually if you're not impacting those sort of top and bottom line metrics, the ones in the middle don't really matter. So obviously there's other things that go into those, but that for me is the metric that culture champions, people leaders, business leaders need to be tracking. Are the cultural changes we're making impacting our revenue, our customer retention and acquisition, and our profitability and productivity?
No, that makes total sense. And on the engagement surveys and stuff that, and I think recently there was one that just came out. Actually, it was for the WRU. So it's not quite employment engagement, but it's the same principle. But the questions are sort of worded to get the answers that you want. And I think that's always the danger with engagement surveys. And, I think they can maybe give a false sense of security on that front. Do you think, is that a reason to not do engagement surveys then?
Yeah, there's a lot of issues with engagement surveys, and it depends how you use them and which ones you use. It's interesting. There's lots of companies that do engagement surveys, And if you look on their websites, typically they'll say, oh, this company's engagement score jumped 25% when they started using our surveys. It's like, oh, their engagement went up when they started using your survey. There's no incentive for you to make their engagement go up, was there? So you're right, the design of the survey is important. I think engagement scores are useful, but they're useful in context. They're useful as an indicator, not the indicator. But as a starting point, and I'll talk a bit more about this, we've actually just created a culture scorecard that companies can use. It's free. It takes about 3-4 minutes for them to fill in, and they get a culture score at the end of it. So if people want to know where they are right now, that's a really good place to start, and then they could go back to that over time and see how they're improving in different categories. But it's really aligned to the operating system we've developed, so I can talk a bit more about that as well.
Yeah, no, cool. Well, yeah, no, actually, I mean, I think that's something that's coming across is that you guys are not looking at high performance culture in a traditional way. It's very forward thinking. So without giving too much away, because it's probably better if people want to speak to you that they pick up the phone and speak to you direct. Can you explain your company's methodology in sustaining high performance cultures and how that is different from what's gone before?
I talked before about sort of this recognition that culture was the difference, right, between success and failure. But that's only so useful to realize. And I think most people would go, yeah, that makes sense, right? But then what do you do about it? So there was then a second phase to what we've been developing and researching and refining over the last few years, which was, okay, so if that is true, how do you then develop that high performance culture? What are the elements of it? And at first that's difficult to distill, because you could take a company with a great culture that you really admire and you would really like a similar culture. But if you try and copy all the things that they do, even if you've got a similar sized company doing the same sort of thing, you've got a different set of people. And so copying what they do won't work necessarily. So the second phase of what we went and did was we went and distilled all of those initiatives, practices, frameworks, all that kind of stuff into a set of principles. So we tried to take it up one level to what are the themes, what are the principles, what are the categories people focus on, companies focus on. And again, that took a long time, and the first version of that wasn't perfect, and we've refined that over the last few years to come to this version that we have now of what we call the culture operating system. So essentially there are 7 elements to high performance culture in the culture operating system. And if you think of it like a Parthenon, you have 2 foundational pieces. So the first is mission, purpose, and vision. So you need to have real clarity on where you're trying to go, why what you're doing matters, and also what the company will look like, what the story of the company will be if you achieve that mission. That last part's really important, because often companies are quite clear on their mission. A lot of them are clear on their purpose, but in terms of vision, they go, I'll get to this much revenue or da-da-da-da-da. Those are factors. But if you can tell your story in advance, then people who work in your company, and also probably your customers and suppliers and things like that, they can align their personal story to that story. And so it'll really help with retention and engagement and those sorts of things. So getting really clear on what that future narrative is really important. So that's the first foundation. And if you think of kind of alongside that, the second block of the foundation is values and non-negotiables. Lots of elements to that, but essentially it's what kind of organization are you trying to build? There's lots of different ways to build a company. There's no one right way. There are probably some wrong ways, but you can achieve the same goals in various different ways, right? And some companies will be very high performance driven and not very tolerant and all that kind of stuff. Some will be very inclusive and supportive, and neither of those is right or wrong. It's just a different way to achieve a goal. So you've got to decide what kind of company you're building, create a set of values. Some people don't like the term values. It can be a set of principles, a credo. At Versapia, we have a manifesto, which serves the same purpose. You can call it different things. But it's essentially, what are those fundamental principles, rules, laws that you're going to build your company around? And so the first thing is getting those 2 foundational pieces in place. Then on top of that, and a lot of companies miss that, by the way. So they try and do the tactical stuff without laying that foundation. And so what you end up with is a bunch of stuff, some of which might work, some of which probably doesn't, but it's not connected by anything foundational. So then on top of those foundations, you've got 4 pillars. So the first 2 pillars is talent acquisition. So are you bringing the right people into your company? And this is heavily informed by the values and non-negotiables, because it's not just about the right skills, it's also about the right individuals that share values, share beliefs with you. Now, there's several elements to this in terms of how you create an engaging experience, how you attract candidates in the first place, how you assess them really robustly. There's diversity and inclusion elements to this, because the biggest mistake that people make with hiring is that they focus on culture fit. So culture fit squashes diversity, it creates homogenous teams. So hiring for values fit is much better than culture fit. There's a whole element around deciding what you actually need and all this kind of stuff. But talent acquisition is really key, because actually if you get the right people on the bus, everything else gets so much easier. It's a big part of culture, but you've got to be able to define that in the first place, which again is where the foundations come in place. Your second pillar is performance management and alignment. So is everyone super clear on what they're trying to achieve, what their own objectives are? Are those objectives aligned? Is there a golden thread running through from that mission and vision to company objectives, department objectives, individual objectives? What are we doing in the next 90 days, the next month, the next week? What are we doing today that leads towards that 10, 15, 20-year vision? All those things have to align. And then you've got to help people to achieve those goals. So it's kind of companies that we go into, especially early stage companies, they either have no performance management, or performance management is inconsistent, or it's used in a remedial way. It's like if someone's underperforming, then they have performance management. But you think about a Formula One team, they review what's happening after every race, right? Or you think about the Navy SEALs, they do an after-action review after every mission. So performance management needs to be a constant thing. And actually, top performers really like being reviewed and scored and given feedback and all that kind of stuff. So that's the second pillar. The third pillar is all about developing people. So that can be career progression, skills progression, getting new experiences, that kind of thing. And those 2 pillars really align well, because your objectives and performance management should be stretching people. If you're going to stretch people, you've got to help them to achieve things that they haven't achieved before. So developing people is really key. It's a massive factor in retention. So LinkedIn did a survey a few years back where they surveyed people who'd left their jobs in the previous 12 months. And they asked them various questions, including what would have made you stay longer at your previous employer. And 94% of people said that they would have stayed longer if they felt the company had invested in their development, which is a huge number, right? 94%. So it tells you, first of all, that people care about it, but also the bar's really low. A lot of companies are not investing in their people, which actually is madness if you think about it, because if your people get better at what they do and increase their capability, then your company gets better and the capability of your organization as a whole increases. So it's crazy not to invest in people's development. But there you go. It often gets deprioritized because everything's busy, right? So then your final pillar on top of those foundations is, we call it employee experience and continuous cultural improvement, which is a bit of a mouthful. But you kind of think about it as like experience and environment. So people's experience of working for your company is the reality for them of working for your company. And the key sort of concept in here is about creating feedback loops. So what you've got to make sure you're doing is getting lots of feedback from your people in lots of different formats, and then taking action on the things that you can take action on. It doesn't mean doing everything they ask for, but you give feedback on the things you can't do, you explain things, and you listen to your employees. I don't think people really expect their employer to be perfect. I think they want to understand that they are listening and that they're trying to make things better. And if you can make things better for your employees, then you probably should. It's probably a good idea. there are going to be things you can't do, obviously. But, you know, within environment, there also comes things like the physical environment, there comes things like communication, diversity, equity, and inclusion, particularly these days, you know, remote and hybrid working, how you manage that. All those kind of factors fall into that pillar as well. So it's kind of like the space that your team operate in. And then finally, you have the roof of the Parthenon, right? So on top, you have inspiring leadership. And this is really, really key, because you can do all the other stuff right, but if your leaders aren't behaving in the right way, aren't motivating people, aren't role modeling, aren't communicating properly, the whole thing's going to fall down. So this is the methodology that we work on. Now, the key sort of consideration in this is, where does each company need to focus? Because there's lots of things underneath each of those elements of the operating system, but you can't do it all at once. And so you've got to decide, well, what are the 2 or 3 key priorities? Because if you try and do everything, it creates too much friction. So that's the first part, is figuring out where are you against those things and what are the highest priority things, and then you can take action. You asked me as well where it's different than things that exist already. And, you know, I've looked for a long time for something like this, a sort of comprehensive methodology, if you like, for taking a company from wherever it is to wherever it needs to go. And I haven't been able to find anything. There's lots of research, there's lots of technology, there's lots of books that are interesting. You know, there's some classics like 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, The Culture Code, the work that Daniel Coyle did. Really good books, but they don't provide a complete system. And I was really surprised when I was looking into this. So this is where it's different. It's a system that not only makes culture tangible, it makes it actionable as well, it makes it measurable, it makes it clear and gives people real confidence and guidance in what specifically to focus on, what specifically to do, and then what to do next, and what to do next, and what to do next, and what to do next. But one of the key caveats with that is, we never tell a company what their culture should be. So all of the tools that exist within that operating system, they help companies define the culture that they want. And then once they've defined that, they help them to embed that culture and to continue to evolve it. But it's never going to go, you should build a culture like this. May recommend against certain things, but there's lots of freedom to be unique within that operating system.
Yeah. Oh, amazing. Well, and it makes total sense to me, because obviously every company is different, has different challenges and stuff. So, yeah, not having that one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter approach, it makes total sense to me. Now, you know, we've talked about the human element of stuff, and I know that you're, you know, deep into AI and the possibilities of that. So can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a really key element of what we're doing at Versapia. So when we developed the operating system methodology, it was all done very manually, because, like I said before, every company is different. So you had to tailor the way that it was used, the way that it was implemented, the things it focused on, to each individual situation. Now, the problem with doing that manually is it takes ages, and you have to fit into someone else's schedule, and consultants are expensive. And this isn't sort of as simple as, in A, B situation, do C and D, right? There's a bit more nuance to it than that. And there always is a bit of interpretation that comes with anything cultural, because it involves people, right? So this was really why we set up Versapia, was we refined this approach, we developed it over the last 3 years, but we'd got to a point where it was so expensive to deliver that it was then limiting which companies we could do it for. And because high-performance culture is such a key element in success, we wanted that to be available to every company. We didn't want the cost to be a limiting factor. So one of the things we'd been doing was looking at, well, could we train an AI model to deliver this, to tailor it to do part of what we do at least? And so we started training them, we started looking at the output, and it turns out, actually, AI is very, very good at tailoring things to individuals and to individual organizations, and taking lots of diverse input that's a bit ambiguous and a bit messy, and clarifying it. So yeah, at the core of what we're doing at Versapia is, yes, the foundation of this culture operating system, but delivered by an AI-enabled platform that then helps companies to define their culture, diagnose their culture, to design their specific strategy, to then deliver that strategy, and then, as you say, to iterate, because it never stands still, right? Once you've done the first couple of things, then there are more things to do, more things to do, and you want to take feedback and adjust and all that kind of thing. So, yeah, we're at a point where AI has developed enough that it's incredibly effective at these sort of things. So that's what we're building.
Cool. No, it sounds really, really interesting. And you know, we all know that one of the sort of reactions to the force of AI is, oh, well, people are going to lose their job. You know, it's going to be a replacement for humans. So how are you balancing like AI and all of that good tech stuff with the more human-centric side of you know, culture and people?
It's a really good question. So I think, yes, there will be changes in the workforce, but I still think you're going to need to bring teams of people together. They're probably going to be slightly smaller teams than you have now. But, you know, in a world where everybody can now be a really high-level generalist because all the knowledge in the world is not only accessible, as it has been for a long time, but eminently sortable and searchable and all that kind of thing. The real power comes in bringing specialist knowledge together, which currently, you know, people are the best at doing. Now, again, these things will move on, but I don't think we're going to see no companies in the future. We're going to see smaller companies. And in smaller companies, actually, culture is even more important, because bringing the right people together, getting them aligned around the right things has such a huge impact. If you've got 100,000 people and 10 people are not on the same page, it doesn't really matter as long as the other 999,990 are on the same page, right? Or even if 1,000 people are not on the same page, it's not the end of the world. If you've got a group of 20 people and 3 of them are not on the same page, that's a real issue, right? Because it's such a big proportion of your company. So I think there will be more companies because we're being enabled to execute on more ideas, more problems. They will be smaller, but that actually increases the importance of high-performance culture. So in terms of how we're balancing those things, I think culture is really driven by the relationships between people. We're not going to replace that, and technology won't replace that. What we're trying to do is enable people to get more out of those relationships. So to enable them to be better managers, better leaders, to create a culture in which people can do their best work, to not have to spend their time thinking about, well, how do we put the right performance management process in place, to just put a performance management process in place that's right for those people. Because a lot of what we do when we're running businesses is repeatable if we learn from other businesses. And so that's what it is. It's getting the tools, the knowledge, the frameworks at the fingertips of the people who are trying to create culture so that they can focus on the relationships internally, the relationships with customers, the relationships with other people that really drive businesses.
Yeah, no, I think, you know, like when you describe this stuff, you know, and seeing how tech and people come together for proper long-term sustainability, I think it's brilliant. It makes me want to build up a company of 1,000 people, and just so I can do it. Unfortunately, I can't. But the people watching, if they want to get started on this journey, what's the best way to go about it?
Yeah, so the best and easiest thing to do first, I mentioned earlier the culture scorecard we've created. So as I said, it's completely free. Takes 3 minutes. You'll answer 16 multiple choice questions and you'll immediately get a culture score broken down into 8 categories. So you'll have a really clear picture of where you are, where your strengths are, where the gaps are, that kind of stuff. So it's a really easy way to get started. So that people can access at https://scorecard.versapia.ai. And that's the best thing to do.
Perfect. Oh, well, thanks for sitting down, Tom. It sounds really exciting. And I hope lots and lots of people get in touch with you because I think a lot of companies need it. So thanks, Tom.
Thanks very much, Nick.